Now I'd like to introduce the presenter for today's webinar, Jules Evans. Jules is the director of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project, and he's the author of 4 books, including one called The Art of Losing Control. And then he was a co-editor on the book Breaking Open, Finding a Way Through Spiritual Emergency. That was co-edited with Tim Reed. He writes a weekly newsletter on the integration of ecstatic experiences, which you can find at ecstatic-substack.com. So without further ado, here's Jules.
Thank you very much, Ron, and thank you to ISPS-US for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about a topic that I'm really interested in and some of the thoughts and research I've done on this area, and some of the questions that are still to be answered, where there could be more research, more collaboration. I've got some slides, which I'm going to just share now. So I'm going to talk for half an hour, then do a quick break for a few questions, then talk for a second half hour, and then we've got 30 minutes or more for Q&A and discussion after that. And I'm going to be talking about the Mysticism Psychosis Continuum. This is my structure. First of all, I'm going to talk about the cultural fault line between mysticism and psychosis in Western culture and how that shifted historically. I'm going to also emphasize that mystical experiences can be both spiritual, beautiful, and meaningful, and also terrifying, bewildering, quasi-psychotic, and potentially harmful. So one of the key points I want to make is this kind of both and of spiritual mystical experiences. Then I'm going to look a little bit at the psychedelic renaissance and why the growing popularity of psychedelics makes this an urgent research area. And I'm going to raise some questions really at the end about how psychedelic and psychotic harm reduction projects and people can learn from each other. So first of all, why I'm interested in this topic. So I'm a writer and historian. I also work at something called the Centre for the History of the Emotions at Queen Mary, University of London. And I've been fascinated by and drawn to mystical experiences since I was a teenager. So I started experimenting. My friends and I started experimenting with psychedelics when we were young teenagers. I first took LSD when I was 14, and also tried things like MDMA, mushrooms. And by 18, my friends and I had already managed to harm ourselves with these drugs. So we'd had some wonderful spiritual, also just fun social experiences in altered states. But first of all, my best friend had a psychotic reaction to LSD when he was 16, and that was 30 years ago. And he's had kind of, suffered from what's been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia for 30 years since. I also developed mental health problems after a kind of bad trip I had when I was 18, which I dealt with in a kind of very English way and just didn't talk to anyone about it for years, including my family. And as a result, I developed what was later diagnosed as PTSD, as also social anxiety, panic attacks, dissociation, and that lasted for years. So basically from 18 to about 24, my mental health was deteriorating. And I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know if it was permanent. Had I just, fried my brain permanently? So that was very scary, obviously. And 2 things helped me to recover from that kind of, crisis. The first was actually kind of Stoic philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, and also cognitive behavioral therapy. Which I learned emerged from Stoic philosophy. And that helped me just to learn how to control my emotions, how to change my thoughts, and so on. And the second thing that helped me was a near-death experience I had following a kind of life-threatening skiing accident. I'm not going to go into it because it's kind of another story. But I was aware then of how both rational and non-rational or ecstatic experiences can heal one, both the rationality of Stoicism and the ecstasy of this, near-death experience. The first book I wrote was about the revival of Stoicism today and how people can use it in their life. And I gave a TEDx talk talking about how Greek philosophy helped me to cope with mental illness after this bad trip. And I was part of the revival of Stoicism in the last 10 years. But that my first book was called Philosophy for Life and Other Dangerous Situations. But at the end of that book, I was aware that there was this whole other approach to healing, which is not the kind of Socratic rational approach, but the Dionysiac, ecstatic, mystical approach to healing. And I'm fascinated by how to balance the rational Socratic with the Dionysiac and ecstatic. How do individuals and cultures balance those two aspects of human experience? So my second book, which came out in 2017, was The Art of Losing Control. And it was about ecstatic experiences, which is another way, you can also talk about mystical experiences, altered states of consciousness, religious experiences, peak experiences. There are different phrases for this kind of experience. I used the ancient Greek term, ecstasy or ecstasis. So ecstasis or ecstasy literally means standing outside. So an ecstatic experience is a moment when you go beyond, you go outside your ordinary sense of self and reality, and you feel deeply connected to a power or intelligence or spirit, something greater than you. That experience can be euphoric, which is the kind of conventional meaning of the word ecstatic, but it can also be terrifying and bewildering, as the Bible put it. What's the quote? It is an awful thing to be in the hands of a living God. An ecstatic experience can be alone, but it can also be a group ecstatic experience, like the Pentecost in the New Testament. And there are many ways that people interpret ecstatic experiences, both spiritual and secular. It could be an ecstatic connection to other people, to nature, to a god, to a spirit, or even aliens. So there's lots of different ways to interpret it. So most cultures at most times have ecstatic rituals for healing, for meaning making, for connecting to other people and to nature and to the divine, and also just for fun. As Aldous Huxley put it, we all need holidays from the self, because it's rather boring and claustrophobic to be stuck in our little separate egos. So ecstatic experiences give us these temporary holidays from the self. Huxley said humans have a basic urge to self-transcendence. So this is just, he argued, a fundamental human urge, and we feed that urge and meet it in many different ways throughout history. You think about ancient Greek culture, for example, it had ecstatic rituals at the heart of its culture. If you wanted a temporary holiday from the self, you had a range of options in ancient Greek culture. You could join the followers of Dionysus, the Maenads. This is a painting actually by Aldous Huxley's uncle, John Collier, and drink wine and maraud across the hills. You could go to the Eleusinian mysteries, which existed for over 2 millennia, and many academics think was some kind of psychedelic ritual. So there were all these kinds of options. And even as rational a philosopher as Aristotle said that a healthy society needs ecstatic rituals to give people catharsis, to give them a kind of purging or release of the discontents of civilization. But the Greeks also understood that ecstasis could be dangerous. This is a vase painting of King Pentheus. And in Euripides' play, the Bacchae, King Pentheus tries to completely banish Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, and his followers from his city. And Dionysus punishes him by sending him mad, and he's ripped apart by the Maenads. So the Greeks understood that Dionysus and Dionysian experiences could be dangerous, could be a kind of divine madness, but also a kind of catastrophic madness. But they understood you can't banish Dionysus. You have to come to terms with this rather unruly aspect of human experience, which is why they try to create cultural containers for the ecstatic. So ecstatic experiences are shaped by our beliefs and by our culture. And historically, Western culture has had a difficult relationship with ecstatic experiences. There's been this kind of fault line that runs through Western history and culture. And how you make sense of an ecstatic experience, if it should happen to you, depends on where you are historically and culturally. So following ancient Greek culture, Christianity, emerging in the kind of 1st century AD, asserted a monopoly over ecstatic experiences, practices, and interpretations. It gradually closed down all kinds of ecstatic rituals and practices, including, for example, the Eleusinian mysteries, and said, okay, there's only one correct sort of ecstatic experience, and that's one that unites you to Jesus and to the Christian God. And if you have an ecstatic experience and it doesn't connect you to Jesus and God, then it's heretical and demonic. I don't know if you can you hear banging, Ron? Let me know if I can go and ask them to stop it, if so. Okay, seems to be all right. So there's some construction work happening next door. So it was rather risky to admit to an ecstatic experience in the Christianity. You could be treated as a prophet or a saint, granted charismatic authority like Joan of Arc, and kind of status. But you could also be treated as possibly demonically possessed and burnt at the stake as a heretic, as also happened to Joan of Arc. So it was still ecstatic experiences were seen as rather risky and dangerous in Christian culture, though they still very much had a place. What happened then in the 16th century and the 17th centuries during the Reformation was this monopoly of the Vatican Church over ecstatic experiences was exploded. And you had all kinds of different ecstatic movements and ecstatic cults, prophets, and different interpretations of ecstatic experience. And that was both liberating, but also quite chaotic and destructive, because some of these ecstatic movements were revolutionary, were violent, and homicidal and cultish. So you can see that in the 16th and 17th century, you had these ecstatic movements leading to fanaticism and violence, and wars between competing movements claiming their ecstatic experience was correct and everyone else's was demonic. So during the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, a quarter of the German population died. So if you want to get a sense of some of these ecstatic movements in the 16th and 17th century, a really good book is this by the historian Norman Cohen called The Pursuit of the Millennium. As a result of this century and a half of religious fanaticism and violence, religious ecstasy got a bad reputation and name in Western culture. So in the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers criticized and pathologized religious ecstasy. So this is a famous painting by Goya, for example. It's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. If you're not being rational in Enlightenment culture, you're being delusional. Ecstatic experiences are seen as delusion. Your imagination is getting carried away. And so ecstatic experiences are a threat to the reasonableness and the self-control of Enlightenment society. You have leading Enlightenment philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, David Hume, criticizing religious ecstasy as just a form of delusion. They called it enthusiasm, which in the Enlightenment is a bad term. It means you're letting your imagination carry you away. You're believing in things that don't exist, like spirits, angels, and God, because of course, this was also a shift from an animist to a materialist culture in which there are no spirits, there is no God.